Welcome to this episode of the 929 English Podcast. It's a treat, as always, to welcome back Rachel Sharansky Danziger.
Thank you, Rabbi Adam.
Today, as we approach the fast day of Tisha B'Av, and we find ourselves in those days leading up to Tisha B'Av, called in Hebrew Bein HaMitzarim, called in English just colloquially the 3 weeks, it's a time to really reflect on the temple and its destruction. The Talmud teaches us, Rachel, that the second temple was destroyed because of something called Sinat Chinam. And I want to ask you 2 questions. Number one is, what is Sinat Chinam? Translated, it means hatred for no reason. I don't know about you, but the hatred that I'm familiar with is usually a hatred for a reason. I would never think of Sinat Chinam as 2 words that go together. That's number one. And number 2 is, why should Sinat Chinam have been the reason that the second temple was destroyed?
It's good questions. I also found myself wondering often about the idea of Sinat Chinam, because it just doesn't really match our experience in life. I mean, yes, people sometimes have aversions to other people for no apparent reasons, but that's not really hatred. That's not the common experience that people feel when they say they feel hatred. And then it occurred to me that perhaps the point is not that we hate someone for nothing, but rather that the reason that we hate them for, if we hate them, a reason that looks legitimate, that looks significant to us, would really look like nothing if we looked at it in a different context. So let me elaborate. Let's say I make a mistake. When I consider my own mistake, I consider it in the context of what happened to me yesterday, the conditions in which I made the mistake, what I ate for breakfast and whether I slept well that night, my good intentions, however much they fell short, my commitment to correcting my mistake, my commitment to doing better next time, my sense that I'm learning from my mistake, my sense that I'm sorry for my mistake. And I'm judging this one event that happened, whatever mistake it was that I made, within all of that. When I see somebody else make a mistake, do I extend the same courtesy? Or do I only focus on the mistakes they made? It's very hard to know what's going on in the heart of another person. It's very hard to understand the circumstances that another person is coming from. But maybe if we were able to somehow remember to look at another person and look at whatever it is that makes us feel the strong feeling that we call hatred towards them, in the context of the entirety of that person, of their intentions, of their history, of their future, perhaps we would notice that this attribute, this trait, this mistake, this action, it's so insignificant in comparison to everything else that it would be indeed fair to call it a hatred that's based on nothing. Now, I'm not saying that this is an easy demand. When we interact with other people, a lot of times things are happening fast and we need to move on, and we can't now sit and do a long session of thinking about the other person and figuring out what's going on in their lives. But perhaps when the rabbis were talking about Sinat Chinam, this is what they meant. That what looks to us like a good reason is really nothing in context.
So that is, first of all, an extremely creative psychological way of understanding relationships between people. And obviously that's our tendency, is we react to the interaction, the immediate interaction, rather than taking a step back and looking at the whole, at the bigger picture. And of course, within ourselves, the people who are more successful or more satisfied with themselves are people who are able to take a step back and to look at their whole personal picture rather than kind of be caught up in the moment all the time. Sinat Chinam, it's it's meaningless in the sense of it's minuscule. It's meaningless because it's 1% of the whole, and we've found that one bad percent. But let's take a step back and look at the 99%, and maybe there's a reason that we should like that person.
Can I just add something that I think it's not a yes, but I think that there's another aspect to it that I maybe didn't clarify, that when we think of ourselves, it's easier for us to remember that we're constantly changing. We experience our life as dynamic. When we look at other people, a lot of times what we see is a still picture. And then we move on with our life, but what's in our mind is the still picture of that person at that moment. And maybe years and years and years later, we'll still remember that annoying, terrible thing that this person did in that one moment that's a still picture. But since then, the person changed and grew and perhaps became a very different person, and perhaps reconsidered whatever it was that he did then, or perhaps didn't, just became different enough that it's no longer matters. But in our mind, we're still looking at that still picture.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, because we know the famous Talmudic story about why the temple was destroyed. The story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa was about holding a grudge. That's exactly what you're talking about, holding a grudge. You know, you're caught in that static moment, and literally it's impossible for you to move beyond that static moment. And I think that that's very much what the Talmud's trying to teach us, that we need to move beyond that static moment, because if we're caught in that static moment, only bad things are going to happen. But I think that, you know, your creative way in which you explain Sinat Chinam really raises the bigger question. And that is, I understand what Sinat Chinam is and why it's problematic and why we need to rise above that static view of people. But is Sinat Chinam enough of a problem that the temple, the holy temple in Jerusalem, was destroyed because of it? And just to make the question bigger, you know, the first temple was destroyed and we got a second one. But the second temple was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, and we're still waiting 2,000 years later for a new temple. So Sinat Chinam has actually caused some, you know, still affects us 2,000 years later.
It's a static moment that we got stuck with, in a sense, isn't it? It's a good question. And I think that to address it, I want to take a step back for a second and ask, what is the temple? And, you know, when I was a kid, I thought the temple was this place where you slaughter animals for God. And then on Yom Kippur, the high priest does all these weird things, changing his clothes, going here, going there. This was my vision of the temple. And between you and me, it was a very alienating vision, because why on earth would I care about a place like that that has nothing to do with my day-to-day life? It was very hard to really mourn this place on Tisha B'Av, for example. It was very hard to say in davening that may the temple be rebuilt, and mean it for real. But as I grew up, and especially now actually, as we've been experiencing quarantine and a removal from a lot of the context that gave our life meaning before, the communal context, just the public context, the public spaces context, a lot of the occupational context that people are used to, the child care context, the big one. As we withdrew from all of that and stayed home and tried to create routines that work for us, that make it possible for 2 adults and 3 children to live happily and in a fulfilled way in one small apartment, I realized that the temple was more than a building with animals being killed in it. It was a home. And as we read the parsha, the Torah portions of Leviticus in our home, because we couldn't go to shul, it became very resonant for me. That what the book of Leviticus is instructing us to do is to create a place with routines that help us feel familiar, that help us feel safe, that help us feel at home with God. This is an absurd idea, right? God is everything, and we want to feel at home and nice and warm and cuddly with him. And yet this is exactly what it is. And it's there from the very beginning of the book, when God tells Moshe, if somebody wants to lehakriv korban, to bring close an offering, let them bring it here to Ohel Moed, to the tabernacle. Until that moment, the word korban, the word for offering that stems from the root for growing closer, karev, kuf resh bet, doesn't exist. Until that moment, when we talk about offerings in the Hebrew Bible, we talk about mincha, a gift, or olah, something that's raised up. We're not talking about korban. And suddenly, now that there is a home for God, tabernacle, and later the temple, we can walk in the world towards the temple and feel that we're going closer to God, that we're going both closer and almost into God. Korban also comes from the word for kravayim, which is the insides of an animal or of a person. It's somehow through these rituals, through all those weird alienating practices, we are invited to be with God in a very intimate way. In other words, God is making room for us. When we hate, when we treat another person from this very narrow perspective and look at this one attribute as if it's the face-all of this person, we're failing at making room for another person within us. We're looking at the person through a very, very narrow opening. We're not being expansive. We're not being charitable. We're not making place for the person within our lives, within our perception of the world. So why should God make room for us? Why should God bother to make a place where we can experience his closeness and intimacy with him, with our very body, with our sensual experience, with our soul, with our spiritual, with our mind, with everything we are, when we're not extending the same courtesy to another person?
Wow. Now, I think there's another piece to it. You're talking about how we don't expand to allow other people in, and therefore God doesn't expand to allow us in. What about our lack of expansion to allow God in? To say it a little differently, the intimacy that we feel with God is God allowing us to be intimate with God, but also our ability to do something that allows us to feel intimate with God. And it's so interesting that throughout history, different groups, different people have each found different ways to be intimate with God. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik was famous for claiming that the way to be intimate with God was through religious routine. There was no greater intimacy for Rabbi Soloveitchik than the fact that he would daven mincha every single afternoon. Something that those people who daven mincha feel as if it's a chore or it's kind of a non-event for a few minutes. To someone like Rabbi Soloveitchik, it was that routine that created that intimacy. To the chassid, whether he lived in a shtetl in Europe or whether he lives in Israel or in Brooklyn in New York, it's a different kind of routine. It's not a routine of ritual in the sense of mincha kind of ritual. It's a routine of their way of connecting to God, maybe singing, maybe dancing, maybe celebrating together. But everybody who's able to have those moments of intimacy creates those moments of intimacy. So actually what I think you're describing is the coming together of three pieces of intimacy. One is our ability to make room for other people and our ability to expand to make room for other people. The other is our ability to make room for God, which is a big deal and it's not so easy. And then it's God's willingness, there it's not the word ability, but it's God's willingness to make room for us. And that maybe what God is waiting for is that we should expand to make room for other people, and that we have to have the ability and the willingness to make room for God. And therefore, what God is telling us is, I'm waiting for you literally with open arms. I'm willing to expand to make room for all of you. And maybe that's the flip side of that Talmudic statement that says that the temple was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, that the next temple will be built because of what some Hasidic masters like to call Ahavat Chinam. The same thing, meaning that you love someone also. There may not be any reason to love them. You know, maybe we're caught in the static moment. But if we're going to be caught in the static moment vis-a-vis other people, let's catch the moment that's a good moment. Let's catch the moment of love, not the moment of anger and hatred.
You know, it's interesting because as you're describing that, another idea is coming to me, or another angle for it, which is that you're mentioning how different people create intimacy with God in different ways. Perhaps what was really unique about the temple is that it offered a way that was relevant for everybody, that it allowed us to unite or to commune with each other, and not just with God, by sharing this intimacy. There's something very sad or solipsistic in the way different Jews today pursue intimacy with God in very, very different ways. It's beautiful, it's creative, it's a beautiful Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God, in many ways people find Him, but there's also something deeply satisfying in thinking that we can find a communal way to God. And perhaps for God to make room for this communal way to happen, we first need to work on our horizontal ties with each other, on looking at each other and saying, yeah, I want to be in one community with you, no matter what you're doing, no matter how different you are from me. And that's perhaps another aspect of that love that we need to restore between us, for God to say, you know what? You're earned to meet me as a community now, because you can be a community, in a sense.
And I'll just conclude by saying that Josephus describes that in the days of Herod, in the last years of the Second Temple, that there used to be over 1 million Jews that used to come to the temple, to Jerusalem, on each of the holidays. Even if we assume that Josephus exaggerated tremendously, the image is a very strong and striking image. Can you imagine, Rachel, 1 million people on the Temple Mount? Can you imagine 1 million people trying to work with one another, trying to give sacrifices to get closer to God, to get closer in the temple? But each one doesn't just worry, each person not just worrying about him or herself, but worrying about the neighbor. Because if you have so many people, the only way I'm going to get close is if I make room for you when we get close together. And that image always struck me, and I think that's really what you're saying. That was the image of the temple. The temple wasn't only to get close to God, but it was to get close to God by figuring out how to deal with one another. And that now we haven't had a temple for 2,000 years. But if we want that experience of a temple, whatever that temple is going to be, it's only if we're able to make room for other people.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And talking about the temple and Sinat Chinam, we always end with the wish that we should all make room for other people, and that, please God, God will make room for all of us.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Adam.
Thank you so much.